It is still possible this deal could be put together. But that social media post from the president moments ago suggests that that is a much less real prospect than it was this morning, just a few hours ago.
And Major, earlier this week, we saw President Trump meet with French President Emmanuel Macron, and then we saw him meet with the Prime Minister of the UK, Keir Starmer. And those are leading up to this meeting with Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Do you think, in your expertise, that this very contentious meeting is going to have an impact on the relationships with those two countries that we just met with?
If everything falls apart, yes, because the imperative for the French president and the British prime minister was to reinforce America's commitment to Ukraine, understand that the French and the British and maybe others in Europe are willing to put peacekeepers in there, provided there is a ceasefire and an end of hostilities that has real teeth, that gets Russia out and puts protections in for Ukraine. Those were the kind of things the Europeans and the French and the British leaders were coming to the White House to underscore. And in public, in all their conversations, President Trump appeared to be on board. The way to make that more concrete, more legible for Russia to see and for the Ukrainians to see would be to get this rare earth mineral deal signed and the implied security that comes with it. Because as the Trump administration often says, if the United States is committed financially to Ukraine's future, that implies and tells Russia, don't mess with us because we're going to be there. And we're aligned economically with Ukraine, and that's a red line for Russia. So don't cross us. That's the way the Trump administration has talked about this, both publicly and privately. But if that deal falls apart, and basically Trump says, Zelenskyy, get out of the White House and don't come back until you're ready for peace, and implied in that is to grovel on my terms, then that works very much to Russia's short-term interests.
Major Garrett, thank you so much from our CBS News headquarters there in Washington. I want to bring in now CBS News national security contributor Sam Vinograd. Sam, great to be with you. All right, what was your reaction to that explosive meeting we just witnessed?
Well, if we dial back just the pure shock value of that, I have to say it is relatively unsurprising based upon President Trump for the past several weeks putting President Zelenskyy of Ukraine and Putin on equal footing and really creating a false equivalency between these two leaders when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, when, of course, Putin is an accused war criminal who invaded a sovereign country. It really underscores the fact that President Trump does not view supporting Ukraine as the core national security interest. He views it as charity. The whole notion that Ukraine doesn't have cards to play is really anathema in modern history. Countries did not need cards before when it came to defending their democracies because they knew that they could count on the United States. Walking away from that moment, again, still reeling from what happened, a core question for me is whether President Trump decides to withdraw any existing support for Ukraine in the near term, like our Patriot anti-missile system battery that's currently deployed, authorization to use long-range weapons, U.S. weapons into Russia, and more. So there are some near-term steps Trump could take if he truly wants to undermine Zelenskyy's leverage in this war.
And the big concern is for folks in Ukraine and around Europe is what if the U.S. pulls out from supporting Ukraine altogether? What would happen to the future of Ukraine?
It is very unlikely that Ukraine could continue to hold territory against Russia if the United States does withdraw support. European forces are preparing, and European countries, to step in to make up for any decrease in U.S. security assistance. But it's not one for one. The United States provides billions of dollars in security assistance to Ukraine, missile defense systems, intelligence, logistics and communication support, and more. So if the United States did withdraw support, it's not like Europe could just step in and immediately replace what the United States has been providing. I do think Europe is scenario planning for that moment, but it's not a one-for-one exchange. And Ukraine would likely lose an incredible amount of territory relatively quickly, absent U.S. support. And further, it is naive to think that Putin will stop in Ukraine. We've seen that play out over the course of history. So for the Europeans, their fear is not just Ukraine falling to Russia, but Putin marching further into Europe, hence Zelensky's comment about gambling with World War III.
And you have to be wondering what China is watching when all of this is transpiring there. All right, Sam Vinograd, thank you so much for that insight. And this just in, that planned press conference between President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and President Donald Trump has been canceled. We're keeping an eye on the doors of the White House to see if President Zelenskyy is still in that building, if he actually leaves. I want to bring in CBS News foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tyab, who is live now from Kyiv in Ukraine. Imtiaz, I know it's early in the morning there. It's very hard to talk to people, but can you just kind of give me your reaction to this explosive exchange we saw there at the White House?
Yeah, it's almost hard to find words to really describe the feeling here in Ukraine, having watched that scene unfold in the White House. You have to remember, just this morning, there was a tiny sense of optimism. Remember, just 24 hours ago, President Trump sort of walked back to his false claim where he accused Volodymyr Zelenskyy of being a dictator. And so many had hoped that although this deal was going to be signed, that these two leaders could potentially turn a page and we could see the U.S. and Ukraine working together again in a very productive way, much of they've done since the start of Russia's invasion, and that seems to have all fallen apart. And you have to remember, for the people of Ukraine, this is a terrifying moment. This is a country for the last 3 years has just been brutalized by Russia. Russia launched that full-scale invasion, occupying some areas, leaving behind massacres which really defy belief, and currently occupies around 20% of this country. And the fighting is ongoing every single day. We know tens of thousands of Ukrainians have lost their lives. Tens of thousands more Ukrainians have lost their limbs. There are children growing up with fathers and mothers because of this war, but they believe they had the United States at their back. They believe they had a U.S. president beside them. And now they feel very differently given that exchange we just saw in the White House, and many are wondering just what is going to happen next and what that means for the future of their country they have fought so bravely for.
In that exchange, Imtiaz, President Trump said to President Zelenskyy, you should be grateful, if not for the U.S.'s support and help, that this war would have been over in 2 weeks. You are on the ground there in Ukraine, have covered this war extensively since it began. How much of an impact has the U.S. involvement had on the people of Ukraine and this conflict?
Extraordinary. And what's so shocking about that statement is if you talk to Ukrainians, the level of gratitude they have for their American partners is extraordinary. There's so much gratitude for the U.S. There's so much gratitude for everything the United States has done for this country. There, of course, is gratitude for European partners as well. This coalition to support Ukraine in this fight against Russia, which, as we know, launched this war. It was not Ukraine who started it. This was Russia. As you were hearing earlier, in 2014, Russia also seized territory of Ukraine. That conflict was essentially frozen, and then we saw this full-scale invasion again, and now it's been grinding on for 3 years. I have never seen a people more grateful, for lack of a better phrase, for the support that they've received from the U.S., from the rest of the world, from Ukraine. So to hear that from President Trump, I think many people here would be incredibly shocked and frankly hurt by it. But more importantly, the war is happening here. This is where people are dying. This is where people are losing their homes, their livelihoods, and more importantly, do not know what will happen next for them and their families. There's also 6 million Ukrainians who have fled the war, who are living abroad as refugees. They just want to come home. They too want to see an end to this war. But like many others, not just here in Ukraine, but indeed around the world, not on Vladimir Putin's terms. And yet it feels like in this moment, this very well could be how this conflict ends, if it does end.
Now, before this explosive meeting, Imtiaz, the majority of Ukrainians believe that President Zelenskyy coming to the White House to sign this rare earth minerals deal, even though it's in exchange for support, monetary support, almost it reads a little bit like a bank loan. But were they optimistic that by signing this deal, there was going to be a clear path to peace?
Look, there's a lot of pragmatism here in Ukraine. Countries at war, countries which are experiencing the kind of devastation that people here in Ukraine are experiencing, you have to make these difficult decisions every day. And so we're talking about presidents, we're talking about governments, but your average Ukrainian understands that there has to be sacrifices have to be made. Yes, when it comes to things like mineral wealth or sharing resources and that sort of thing. That wasn't lost on Ukrainian people. And again, yes, you're right. Many people had hoped that this was an opportunity for President Zelenskyy and President Trump to turn the page, to enter into a new era of partnership, which would of course be very different from the Biden era, but at least a new era of partnership. But reading that post on the president's social media site, where it doesn't sound like that is actually what's going to be happening here, it's no doubt going to be the cause of a lot of alarm here in Ukraine as people try to decipher what that means and, frankly, what it does mean. What does the president mean when he made those statements? Does this mean that support for Ukraine will abruptly end? Or does it mean that more negotiations will be had, that Ukraine will have to make more concessions to the U.S.? We just don't have the answer to those questions. But here in Ukraine tonight, there's going to be a huge amount of concern by that scene that they saw in the White House, and the concern that President Zelenskyy may be leaving the White House and that they don't have an agreement with the president, and things could be falling apart very quickly.
Imtiaz Tyab live for us in Ukraine, in Kyiv. Thank you so much, Imtiaz. All right, I want to talk a little bit more about that Truth Social post said by the president just moments ago there after that meeting, writing, quote, "We had a very meaningful meeting in the White House today. Much was learned that could never be understood without conversation under such fire and pressure. It's amazing what comes out through emotion, and I have determined that President Zelenskyy is not ready for peace if America is involved because he feels our involvement gives him a big advantage in negotiations. I don't want advantage, I want peace. He disrespected the United States of America and its cherished Oval Office. He can come back when he is ready for peace." All right, let's bring in CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes, who is live for us outside the White House. Nancy, we heard the press conference that we're all waiting for. That's canceled. Is President Zelenskyy going to stay? Any word of whether he's left the White House altogether?
He's still here, but it's unclear how much longer he'll be here and whether he's going to speak to reporters at all now that the news conference is off. It appears that the signing of this minerals deal, which is the whole reason he flew here to D.C., might be off as well. Just outside of view, Liz, about 20 or 30 yards from where we're standing, he is getting into his vehicle. You see right there. There are hundreds of reporters gathered right there at the exit of the West Wing who were hoping to ask him some questions, but it appears that he is now going to depart. He did have an interview scheduled for later this afternoon with Fox News. We'll see if that actually comes to pass. But obviously right now, Liz, this meeting with the President of the United States ending not at all the way Zelenskyy was hoping it would.
Not how anybody thought it would happen, given the meetings with French President Macron and Prime Minister Keir Starmer earlier this week. Any other reaction you're hearing from anyone else because of this meeting there at the White House?
Well, Democrats are horrified, and they have made no secret of that. They have taken to social media to express their dismay. They're calling it an embarrassment. They are saying that Zelenskyy is a hero and Trump is a coward, things like that. They are very upset. Everybody wondering where things can possibly go from here. Liz, it's really interesting because since the beginning of this conflict, Zelenskyy has taken an approach very similar to the one that we saw today. He took the same approach with President Biden. Yes, he did express his gratitude for assistance that came from the U.S. and the Europeans, but he always pushed for more. And that was his strategy for a very important reason. As you see him now departing, you're actually going to see him pass behind us in just a moment as he drives past our cameras on the way out of the White House complex. So the reason that he has always taken the confrontational approach that you saw in the Oval Office is because he understands that the U.S. and other nations don't necessarily have an immediate national security interest in Ukraine's sovereignty. The U.S., as he said again today, is an ocean away. We are not immediately threatened by what Russia does to Ukraine. And so what he always tried to do was to make this bigger, to say that this is good against evil, and that's why you need to help. This is Vladimir Putin. If he's willing to come into my country, maybe he'll come into your country next. Pushing, pushing, pushing. There were times when President Biden didn't appreciate that approach. He held his tongue in public, but then in private afterwards, he would complain about Zelenskyy and his demands, and he might call him a name or two that sometimes leaked out. But in public, they always showed a united front. President Trump, very different from President Biden. And when Zelenskyy tried that approach today with Trump in the Oval Office, it clearly did not go down as well.
Nancy, I want to remind our viewers who may be just joining us right now what we're talking about here. In case you missed it here on CBS News 24/7 and CBS News, we just saw an extraordinary moment play out in the Oval Office moments ago. An incredibly heated exchange over Russia's war in Ukraine and the push for peace. Now, this all happened during that high-stakes meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, President Trump, and Vice President JD Vance. Watch.
I want to see if we can get this thing done. You want me to be tough? I could be tougher than any human being you've ever seen. I'd be so tough. But you're never going to get a deal that way. So that's the way it goes. All right, one more question.
Hey, I want to respond to this. So look, for 4 years in the United States of America, we had a president who stood up at press conferences and talked tough about Vladimir Putin, and then Putin invaded Ukraine and destroyed a significant chunk of the country. The path to peace and the path to prosperity is maybe engaging in diplomacy. We tried the pathway of Joe Biden of thumping our chest and pretending that the President of the United States' words mattered more than the President of the United States' actions. What makes America a good country is America engaging in diplomacy. That's what President Trump is doing.
Can I ask you?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So he occupied our parts, big parts of Ukraine, part of East and Crimea. So he occupied it on 2014. So during a lot of years, so I'm not speaking about just Biden, but those time was Obama, then President Obama, then President Trump, then President Biden, now the President Trump, and God bless, now President Trump will stop him. But during 2014, nobody stopped him. He just occupied and took. He killed people. You know what the contact line?
2015.
2014
2014.
and 2014.
2014.
Yeah. So
I was not here.
Yeah, but
That's exactly right.
Yes, but during 2014 till 2022, yeah, the situation the same. The people are been dying on the contact line. Nobody stopped him. You know that we had conversations with him, a lot of conversation, my bilateral conversation, and we signed with him. Me, like a new president. In 2019, I signed with him the deal. I signed with him, Macron and Merkel, we signed ceasefire. Ceasefire. All of them told me that he will never go. We signed with him with gas contract. Gas contract. Yes, but after that, he broken this ceasefire. He killed our people and he didn't exchange prisoners. We signed the exchange of prisoners, but he didn't do it. What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the President for trying to bring it into this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Come once.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military? And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems, even you, but you have nice ocean. and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless.
You don't
God
know that.
bless. You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because
I'm
you're in no
answering on this
position to
question.
dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly what
this.
you're doing.
I'm not
You're in
dictating.
no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
You
We're
will-
going to feel very
you will
good.
feel influenced.
We're going to feel very
I'm
good and
telling
very
you,
strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed
From the
yourself
very-
to be in a
from
very
the very
bad position,
beginning
and he
of the
happens
war.
to be right about
From the
it.
very beginning of the war.
You're not
Mr.
in a good
Brown,
position.
I
You don't
was
have
in
the
it.
cards right now. With us, you start having
not playing
cards.
cards.
But right now, you don't.
I'm very
Yeah, you're playing
serious,
cards.
Mr. President.
You're
I'm
playing
very
cards.
serious.
You're
I'm
gambling
the
with the
president
lives
in
of
war.
millions of people.
You think-
You're gambling with World War
What do you-
III.
what do you
You're
think about?
gambling with
What do you
World
think
War
about?
III. And
You-
what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country.
I'm
That's
with
backed
all respect to
you
your
far
country.
more than a lot of people said
very
they
respect.
should have.
Have you said thank you once? This
A lot
entire
of
meeting?
times.
No, in this
Even
entire meeting,
today.
have you said thank
Even
you?
today.
You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States
what
of
are you speaking
America
about?
and the president who's trying to save your country.
Please, you think that if you will speak very loudly about the war, you
He's
can...
not speaking loudly. He's not
Yeah.
speaking loudly. Your country's
Can I-
in big
can-
trouble.
can I
Wait a
answer?
minute. No.
Can
You've
I
done a lot
answer?
of talking. Your country is in big trouble.
I know.
You're not
I
winning.
know.
You're not winning this. You have a damn
We-
good chance of
we are
coming out
staying,
okay because of
Mr.
us.
President, we are staying in our country, staying strong from the very beginning of the war. We've been alone, and we are thankful. I said thanks
You haven't
in
been
this
alone.
cabinet,
You
and
haven't
not
been
only
alone.
in this
We
cabinet.
gave you, through
I
this
said
stupid
thank-
president, $350 billion.
You voted
we gave
for
you
your
military
president.
equipment,
You
and you
voted
men
for
are
your
brave,
president.
but they had to use our military.
What about
if,
West
if you didn't have
You
our
invited
military
me-
equipment,
you invited
if
me
you
to
didn't
speak.
have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3
okay?
days, I heard it from Putin. In 3 days, this is something
Maybe
new.
less.
In 2 weeks, of course, yes.
It's going to be a very hard thing to do business like this. I
Again,
tell you.
just say thank you.
I said a lot of
except
times
that there,
thank you
except
to
that,
American people.
Except that there are disagreements, and let's go litigate those disagreements rather than trying to fight it out in the American media when you're wrong. We know that you're wrong.
But you see, I think it's good for the American people to see what's going on.
I understand, sir.
I think it's
I
very
understand.
important. That's why I kept this going so long. You have to be thankful. You don't have the
I'm
cards.
thankful.
You're buried there. Your people are dying.
tell you
You're
again,
running
I
low
know.
on soldiers.
Don't-
Listen,
don't, please,
you're running
Mr.
low on
President.
soldiers. It would be a damn good thing.
Mr.
And then
President.
then you tell us, I don't want a ceasefire. I don't want a ceasefire. I want to go and I want this. Look, if you could get a ceasefire right now, I tell you, you take it so the bullets stop flying and your men stop getting killed.
Of course, we want to stop the war.
But you're
I
saying
said-
you don't want a ceasefire.
But I said to you,
I want a
with
ceasefire.
guarantees.
Because you'll get a ceasefire faster than an agreement.
Ask our people about ceasefire, what they think.
That wasn't
doesn't
with
matter
me.
for you what-
that
what
wasn't
this
with me.
means. It
That was
wasn't
with
with
a
you.
guy named Biden who was not a smart person.
But this
That
is
was
your,
with,
this
that was
is
with
your
Obama.
president. It was your president.
Excuse me. That was with Obama, who gave you sheets, and I gave you javelins.
Yes.
I gave you the javelins to take out all those tanks. Obama gave you sheets. In fact, the statement is Obama gave sheets and Trump gave javelins. You got to be more thankful, because let me tell you, you don't have the cards. With us, you have the cards. But without us, you don't have any cards.
One more question to Mr. Vice President. I'm sorry.
It's going to be a tough deal to make,
Um,
because the attitudes have to change.
what if Russia breaks ceasefire? What if Russia breaks peace talks? What do you do then? I understand that it's a heated conversation right now.
What are you
but
saying?
what
She's
if
asking, what if Russia
Putin
breaks the ceasefire?
What if anything? What if a bomb drops on your head right now?
But they have
Okay?
broken ceasefire
What if they broke it?
many
I don't know. They broke it with Biden, because Biden, they didn't respect him. They didn't respect Obama. They respect me.
But what-
Let me tell you, Putin went through a hell of a lot with me. He went through a phony witch hunt where they used him and Russia. Russia. You ever hear of that deal? That was a phony Hunter Biden, Joe Biden scam. Hillary Clinton, Shifty Adam Schiff. It was a Democrat scam. And he had to go through that. And he did go through it. We didn't end up in a war. And he went through it. He was accused of all that stuff. He had nothing to do with it. It came out of Hunter Biden's bathroom. It came out of Hunter Biden's bedroom. It was disgusting. And then they said, oh, the laptop from hell was made by Russia. The 51 agents. The whole thing was a scam. And he had to put up with that. He was being accused of all that stuff. All I can say is this. He might have broken deals with Obama and Bush, and he might have broken them with Biden. He did, maybe. Maybe he didn't. I don't know what happened. But he didn't break them with me. He wants to make a deal. I don't know if you can make a deal. The problem is, I've empowered you to be a tough guy. And I don't think you'd be a tough guy without the United States. And your people are very brave. But you're either going to make a deal or we're out. And if we're out, you'll fight it out. I don't think it's going to be pretty, but you'll fight it out. But you don't have the cards. But once we sign that deal...
A heated exchange there in the Oval Office just about an hour ago between President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, President Trump, and Vice President JD Vance. That meeting not going to plan. They were there to hopefully sign a rare earth minerals deal. That deal has not been signed. And not too long after that explosive meeting there in the Oval Office, Volodymyr Zelenskyy left the White House altogether. I want to bring in Nancy Cordes, who is live at the White House, who watched this whole thing unfold. Nancy, I want to read you a tweet by Senator Chuck Schumer. He said Trump and Vance are doing Putin's dirty work. Senate Democrats will never stop fighting for freedom and democracy. A lot of reaction coming out of Capitol Hill today to this explosive meeting. What else are you hearing?
A lot of frustration on the part of congressional Democrats. A lot of chest thumping here at the White House from various White House aides who say that this was President Trump and Vice President Vance standing up for America. And, you know, it's Friday night in Europe, so we haven't heard that much from across the pond, but one has to imagine that this is going to be crushing to a lot of European leaders who were hoping that the fact that this minerals deal was about to be signed was an indication that perhaps there was a thawing taking place in the relationship between President Trump and President Zelenskyy. Now things have clearly gone south, as far south as they possibly could have, with Zelenskyy essentially being shown the door here at the White House.
Nancy, real quick before we go to break, any idea where Zelenskyy is now? Is he going to the airport?
He's slated to do an interview with Fox today. He's slated to give a speech, so we're watching to see if those things continue to take place so he can at least get his side out before he heads back to Ukraine.
All right, Nancy Cordes live for us there at the White House. All right, quite an explosive day here on CBS News. CBS News 24/7. You're looking a live shot at the White House there. We're going to continue to follow this breaking news of this explosive meeting out of the White House. You're watching CBS News 24/7.
I think I asked direct questions. I don't know that they're tough questions per se.
When do consumers actually get to touch and feel a difference in their lives?
So you would encourage Democrats to work with Donald Trump on an issue like healthcare. That's the role of Face the Nation, to focus on the issues at hand. That means a civil conversation with perspective.
Sunday morning, Wicked Oscar nominee Cynthia Erivo. A few words from Flo, plus 100 years of The New Yorker. Listen for the trumpet.
It was almost like being face to face with the devil.
Women riding bicycles dismembered.
She just vanished.
48 hours reports.
I fought and fought.
911, what is your emergency?
She disappeared off the face of the earth.
Ever think in your wildest dreams someone might want to kill you?
This almost became a game of psychological warfare.
You're caught. You're gonna go down.
Stream 48 hours, 24/7. CBS Sunday night.
Here we go.
The ultimate tradition continues.
From what I've seen, it's like chaos.
America's longest running news magazine show is back.
For 60 minutes!
60 minutes.
With a new season.
Hey, let's go.
You're willing to talk about anything. I'm open to all of it. Ask me the hard-hitting questions. So how do you get over the nerves? Honestly, it's a whole bunch of mind
The most influential people.
Who's the best coach in college football? Let me see a mirror so I can look at it.
Are you a billionaire yet?
None of your business, man. You trying to get me robbed?
Investigative journalism.
Am I getting a real look at what life is like in here today? Absolutely not.
Do you think people visiting know that these were looted?
When stories threaten our way of life, 60 Minutes demands answers.
This is the pager that Hezbollah was using.
Do you have hope that you may find him yet? They were asking me to do something that was illegal.
They're fighting for faulty parts?
Yeah.
What is the most important takeaway for our audience?
How big of a problem is doping?
Where was the military?
Why are people suspicious?
That sounds like a problem.
How is this possible?
Oh, come on.
Come on.
Whoa.
Wow. What is going on?
I'm Scott Pelley.
I'm John Worth.
I'm Leslie Stahl.
I'm Bill Whitaker.
I'm Sharon Alfonsi.
I'm Cecilia Vega.
I'm Anderson Cooper.
This is 60 Minutes.
The CBS News original.
Showtime, baby.
It's time for 60 Minutes Sunday on CBS. Don't miss a minute. Now streaming. What happens when you get conversation over conflict?
I think they've taught me to have grace and compassion.
When we follow the human side of the headline.
I'm not asking that we ignore disability, rather that we do not ignore ability.
When news takes you where the story happens.
We've just crossed into Lebanon.
When the world's best journalists come together to cover your world, you get the all-new CBS Evening News every weeknight.
CBS News. Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan, Sunday on CBS.
Well, let me start with this.
This really happened.
Have you told the government?
Did any of that make sense?
What's your response?
You want me to just
What's
keep
wrong
going?
with that argument?
What have you learned?
Do you know why?
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 It's time for 60 Minutes, Sunday on CBS.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here on CBS News 24/7. I'm Chanel Call in for Lindsay Reiser. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has now left the White House after things got heated with President Donald Trump. The afternoon started with pleasantries when Mr. Trump greeted his Ukrainian counterpart. But that energy quickly dissolved when the visit moved to the Oval Office. What was expected to be a photo opportunity between the two leaders became a contentious back and forth. The two clashed over the history and future of the war in Ukraine, and now there are questions swirling about the potential for a rare earth minerals deal that the two leaders were expected to sign this afternoon.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly what
this.
you're doing.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very
You
strong.
will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. But right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country, that's backed you far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Shortly after that meeting, the president took to Truth Social to say, quote, "I've determined that President Zelenskyy is not ready for peace if America is involved because he feels our involvement gives him a big advantage in negotiations." He went on to say, "I don't want advantage, I want peace." He disrespected the United States of America and its cherished Oval Office. He can come back when he is ready for peace. Now, this afternoon's joint press conference was also quickly canceled. For more on all of this, let's bring in CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cortez. Nancy, this was a true moment in history. It was spicy. I mean, how unprecedented is this type of exchange filled with so much tension?
Completely unprecedented, Chanel, and things keep going from bad to worse. We just learned that the president essentially kicked Zelenskyy out of the White House after that exchange. We're told that Zelenskyy and his aides wanted to try to smooth things over, but the president wasn't having it and told him to leave. There was a lunch that had been prepared for these two leaders to eat as they continued to negotiate behind closed doors. That lunch went uneaten, and Zelenskyy departed. He is now slated to give a speech at the Hudson Institute, a research organization here in D.C. It's chaired by former presidential candidate Nikki Haley. And as far as we know, that speech is still on, and he's perhaps going to be able to give his side of the story before he departs the U.S. But this is not ending in any way the way that Zelenskyy had hoped when he flew here to the United States, thinking that he was going to be signing a minerals deal with the President of the United States and talking about the terms for a peace deal to come.
Right. So what happens with that rare mineral deal that was supposed to be discussed today?
It's completely up in the air at this point. And as you read from President Trump's Truth Social, he says Zelenskyy isn't ready for peace and he can come back when he is. Now, President Trump has been known to change his mind before, so we'll see if that happens again. He was actually sounding much more positive about Zelenskyy yesterday than he had in the months and years before. So anything is possible, but at this particular moment, Chanel, things could not be worse. And it's definitely going to be a cause for great concern for European officials in particular, who were hoping that things were now heading in the right direction after weeks of President Trump sounding like he was more on Putin's side than Zelenskyy's.
And speaking of that, Nancy, earlier this week, the president, we know, met with other European leaders. Could what happened today impact America's relationship with some of those other European nations?
Sure, although European nations have other concerns. For example, President Trump has threatened to impose tariffs on all European countries, in fact, all countries around the world, reciprocal tariffs. And so they are worried about heading those off and may be reluctant to criticize President Trump too directly when they are also quietly negotiating with the White House to try to head off those tariffs that could hurt not only U.S. consumers, but foreign consumers as well. Great concerns about a trade war with some of our closest allies. And so, we saw Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, in the Oval Office yesterday. And while we know that he has a very different view of the Ukraine war than President Trump does, he really downplayed any disagreement because he is working so hard behind the scenes to head off those tariffs that he believes would hurt his economy.
Okay, Nancy, thank you so much. And now I want to bring in Chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett for more context here. Major, how significant is this moment for the overall trajectory of the war in Ukraine?
It could not be more significant, Chanel. And the president's statement on social media that matters most is this: I don't want advantage. I want peace. I've never seen an American president, and I've covered them since 2000, say out loud in any context whatsoever, domestic or international, especially international, I don't want advantage. Why not? And I want peace at what price? What price is the peace between Ukraine and Russia? You mentioned the visits earlier this week by the French President Emmanuel Macron and the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Both of them came to Washington wanting to remind President Trump that it would be harmful to Europe and to U.S. interests to have a peace settlement with Russia that gives Russia too much, that essentially makes it pay no costs, either economically or in land having to be given up and given back to Ukraine for its invasion of a sovereign country. And they very much fear that peace could be at any price, one that could be more advantageous to Putin and Russia than Ukraine or the more broad interests of Europe writ large. So when the president says, I don't want advantage, that is something that Moscow will hear, write down, and when time comes, because eventually there will be some sort of negotiation, the Russians now know the American president is only interested in peace, not necessarily an advantageous position for Ukraine. And how did this get off the rails in the Oval Office? It got off the rails because Ukrainian President Zelenskyy tried to remind the president and Vice President JD Vance that Vladimir Putin has signed agreements before with Ukraine and broken them. And he has justifiable nervousness about anything that Vladimir Putin would sign now. Why did this bother President Trump so much? Because President Trump believes, to his core, he has a fundamentally unique relationship with Vladimir Putin, that Putin will not cross him, will not go against what he has promised directly to President Trump. Whether that's true or not is less important than the truth that President Trump believes it. His ego was wounded in that moment, and I've seen this play out with President Trump before. When his ego is wounded, especially in public, he has only one response, which is to bring up the tension, bring up the sense of conflict, and defend himself and his ego, and not incidentally, what he believes are the interests of the United States that he pursues, especially in the Oval Office. Those are the key takeaways.
Okay, Major Garrett, please stay with me. We want to come back to you in just a moment. But for now, I want to bring in CBS News foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tyab. He is following the latest on this story from Kyiv this hour. Imtiaz, I know you've been getting some reaction online. Folks there, many of them obviously still sleeping this morning. But what are you seeing in terms of reaction this hour?
Chanel, it's around 9 p.m. here in Kyiv. You can imagine most people aren't really watching TV, but news is starting to trickle in. In fact, we were on the phone with a well-known Ukrainian journalist earlier, and we caught her at the grocery store, and she said, "You have to excuse me, I'm crying." And that, I think, really just sums up the mood here in Ukraine, which is a mixture of shock, disbelief, and dread as to what may come next. You know, many people woke up this morning with a little bit of hope. They heard from President Trump where he was kind of walking back his false allegation that Volodymyr Zelenskyy was, in his words, a dictator. Again, a false allegation. He is a democratically elected leader here in Ukraine. He has pretty good approval ratings in this country. And here we are, this extraordinary scene, again, on a day when many Ukrainians had thought Mr. Zelenskyy was going to go there, sign a deal with President Trump, and potentially turn a page, start a new relationship with this new president that will hopefully, in their view, also end this war, but not on Vladimir Putin's terms. And now that is something that many people here, I would imagine, are not believing is going to happen. And we have to consider this, Chanel. This is a country for the last 3 years has suffered so brutally. We have to consider tens of thousands of people have been killed. 6 million people are abroad living as refugees. Millions are internal refugees, and there are many more people who have suffered wounds that have changed their lives, and there are many more who suffer internal wounds and indeed have lost their homes. Russia occupies 20% of this country. This is a country which has suffered so much pain, so much agony. They want the war to end. But again, not on Vladimir Putin's terms, and many fear that's exactly what's unfolding this evening.
And Imtiaz, you know, based on your reporting there in Ukraine, can you speak about how Vladimir Putin may have watched this moment and interpreted that exchange between the president here in the U.S., President Trump, and Zelenskyy?
It's a really important question, Chanel, and the short answer is that Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin are no doubt reacting with glee at, frankly, that spectacle that we saw at the White House. Again, we've been using the word unprecedented to see a president and a vice president with a world leader in the Oval Office with a huge crowd of journalists around them, and the kind of exchange that we saw. And of course, we now know Mr. Zelenskyy has left. That deal was not signed. And it really just underscores, I think, from the point of view of Vladimir Putin and indeed the Kremlin, that this is exactly what they want. They want to see Volodymyr Zelenskyy isolated. They don't want to be isolated. They want to come out into the world. They want to be welcomed back to the fold in a way that it seems like President Trump is. Remember, not that long ago, there were face-to-face talks in Saudi Arabia between U.S. officials and Russian officials. Not there was Ukraine. Not there were European partners. And it really just feels like this momentum is building in the direction of Vladimir Putin, who, it must be clear, started this war. Not just 3 years ago, but back in 2014, when he annexed Crimea, occupied large sections of the Donbass, and then restarted the war 3 years ago, and the devastation that we've seen ever since. As you rightly point out, I've been reporting on this war almost nonstop for that 3 years, and the devastation we've seen is unspeakable. But very quickly, Chanel, what I do want to say, there was something that really struck me in that exchange, which was Volodymyr Zelenskyy was accused of not being grateful. I've been covering Ukraine for a long time, and since this invasion that was led by Vladimir Putin, I have never met a group of people, or a country, or a nation more grateful for U.S. support than Ukrainians. I mean it, more grateful than Ukrainians. And for them to be in this moment where this country, which they've become to rely on so much, the United States of America, to suddenly take this turn, I think for many Ukrainians tonight, it is not only a sense of dread and confusion, but also deep, deep sadness. Chanel.
I'm glad you picked up on that point, Imtiaz, because there was a lot of talk during that conversation about the amount and type of U.S. support for Ukraine in the last couple of years. Because you have boots on the ground there, I wonder if you can speak to what all that support looks like on the ground in Ukraine, and whether there are now any concerns that that could be threatened.
Yeah, that is the ultimate concern here, Chanel, is that all of this support that has been received, not just from the U.S., and it has to be clear, President Trump has very greatly exaggerated the dollar figure, for lack of a better phrase, of what the U.S. has provided Ukraine. Still, it's in the many, many, many billions of dollars. It's not nothing. But when you consider the fact that the U.S. has provided Ukraine with things like long-range missiles, aircraft, anti-aircraft devices as well, which has really helped Ukraine to repel Russia's drone strikes. In fact, from Saturday of last week up until the day before yesterday, Russia launched some of the largest drone and missile strikes across Ukraine that we've seen since the start of this war. This is a very active conflict, and the support from the U.S., the military support from the U.S., and the diplomatic support from the U.S. has allowed this, frankly, David and Goliath battle, David, of course, being Ukraine, to stand up to the might and the power of Russia in the way that they have could not have been done without the support of the U.S., could not have been done without the support of Europe. And so the fact that there's a possibility that the kind of support we've been seeing from the U.S. may vanish very quickly, that spreads a lot of doom and dread here in Ukraine for people who are at this moment on the front line fighting against Russia.
And Imtiaz, there was another really heated moment where Zelenskyy was trying to tell President Donald Trump that if Ukraine fell, it would have a global impact. Talk about what would happen if the U.S. were to pull support for Ukraine here. What kind of impact we could see, especially immediately in Europe?
Look, the fear is that Vladimir Putin will take over all of Ukraine. He's made it very clear he sees Ukraine as part of Russia. He had this big manifesto at the start of the war where he reasoned as to why he thought Ukraine was part of Russia, and he was well within his right to take over this country. But it's bigger than that, because there are other former Soviet countries that Vladimir Putin may potentially see as rightfully part of Russia. And what if he attacks them? And more importantly, what if Vladimir Putin attacks a NATO country? NATO, of course, is that transatlantic alliance that the U.S. is part of, that Europe is part of, and they have a rule, which is an attack on one country that belongs to NATO is an attack on all of NATO. And so does that mean that the nightmare scenario, which so many people have been trying to prevent, which is all of Europe at war with Russia, is that more likely now than it was just a few hours ago? We don't know the answer to that question, but that is the fear, and the repercussions of what we just saw in the White House could potentially be very, very far-reaching and wide-ranging.
Okay, Imtiaz Tayyab live for us in Kyiv this hour. Thank you. Now I want to bring back Chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett for more context here. Major, we're just learning the White House has said that after the meeting, the Ukrainian officials left the Oval Office in a separated room, and it sounds like they were waiting to see if they could re-engage in some conversations. That didn't happen, and essentially they were escorted out. Based on your reporting, is that pretty extraordinary?
Very. It's for the moment. And President Trump can and does sometimes change his mind and perspective. This could be put back together. But for the moment, it is a significant, hard-to-repair breach in relations between President Zelenskyy and President Trump. And why was Zelenskyy here? He was here because through this week, there had been a negotiating process that we were told had led to an agreement about U.S. access on a long-term basis to rare earth minerals in Ukraine. That would be an important linkage of the two countries. And the Trump administration saw within that agreement not only a way to recoup some of the money sent to Ukraine. It's not anywhere near as much as President Trump says. He always says $350 billion. It's much closer to $120 billion. But this would be a way to recoup some of that. a priority for President Trump. And the administration and the Ukrainians agreed that that linkage, economically and otherwise, would be a de facto way of the United States saying, we're here with Ukraine, and this is an implied security guarantee. This was very important for the Ukrainians to establish. The terms were negotiated all this week. They were more favorable to Ukraine than the original proposition that came from the Trump administration, but they were going to put this deal together. Now that appears to be off for the time being. And President Trump is quite clearly using that as leverage over the Ukrainians, not only in the context of whatever may be negotiated to end this war, but continued U.S. involvement in Ukraine. So the president's terms are now clear. If President Zelenskyy leaves Washington and goes back to Ukraine, he will not be welcomed back to the White House until the terms have become even more favorable to the administration, less favorable to Ukraine. So these next few hours will be crucial in determining whether any of this can be repaired, or at least a semblance of patching them back together can be begun.
Okay, Major Garrett, thank you so much. Again, please stand by with us. We'll come back to you in just a moment. Here now is Jonathan Wachtel, the former senior policy advisor and director of communications at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. Want to start with the United Nations response. Are we seeing any reaction this hour to what happened in the Oval Office this afternoon?
We've been watching, Chanel, reverberations of what's happening at the United Nations over the last weeks. So today, it's just the latest chapter of what has been a complete confusion, a new stance of the United States that we saw recently, the last couple of days, a vote by the United States in favor of Russia over Ukraine in the General Assembly. So the climate has certainly changed. The geopolitics are in motion in ways that we have not seen in decades.
And I wonder, Jonathan, what kind of broader impact this exchange today could have on U.S. relations with some of the European nations who are key as well.
As Major was pointing out, what we witnessed on live television is pretty unprecedented, and it is going to take certainly some very serious mending of fences behind the scenes to try to make up for what we all got to see for our very own eyes. It is remarkable. It does not bode well for the Ukraine, certainly, in terms of the position, and seeing Volodymyr Zelenskyy leave in such great haste after this, it just speaks volumes as to how badly this encounter has turned out.
And, you know, while this, Jonathan, is historic and unprecedented in many ways, we've seen some of the language that President Trump used to describe Volodymyr Zelenskyy in the days leading up to this big meeting. So are you surprised to see it did not go well?
You know, that's a fair point. There already was animus in the air, and we saw it play out in television, as President Trump said himself. This is very interesting television. I don't know exactly those were his words, but he himself knew that what had transpired was something that was filled with sparks and entertaining, I suppose. Certainly for Ukrainians watching this, Europeans watching this, people around the globe, it certainly is very troubling to see a situation in which there is a raging war, an effort to bring about peace, and then a stark difference of opinion among the leadership of the United States and the Ukrainian leadership. So this is really a difficult situation.
And Jonathan, you know, President Trump sent out a statement shortly after this meeting, ending by saying he can come back, Zelenskyy, that is, can come back to the White House when he's ready for peace. I just wonder, Jonathan, from a policy or strategy perspective, what would Zelenskyy have to do to come back, and what might the approach have to be in order to be successful at landing a peace deal?
Well, one thing is abundantly clear, and, you know, I was actually in Kyiv when the deal was struck. I used to be a journalist, and I covered the former Soviet Union extensively when the Budapest Agreement was worked out, in which the United States, France, and the United Kingdom would stand by the Ukraine in the event that Russia would get aggressive here. You know, to be looking at things today with this lens, where it is, one thing is abundantly clear. We cannot see this type of activity happen live on camera, that there needs to be a lot of conversations done away from the cameras, to try to bring down the temperature, to try to get to some sort of place in which there's not that accusatory tone and even, I would say, dressing down that we all witnessed, that will go nowhere. That will continue to grind things into a terrible corner. And the basic truth is this war does need to stop. The aggression needs to stop. We need to get to a place in which there can be peace and some sort of normalcy come back to Europe, in which just so many people have died over the course of these 3 years. It's been such a toll economically, emotionally, physically, such a drain in so many ways. To see it where it is now is just really upsetting.
And I also wonder, Jonathan, you know, one of the things that's come out as a top line in Zelenskyy could have approached this conversation in a different way. What do you make of his reaction to some of those comments in the moment?
Well, the basic truth is that, you know, the Ukrainians have put up a very strong fight, but the Russian Federation is a very powerful nation. Sure, it's got economic sanctions. Sure, it's got a lot of internal difficulties. You know, certainly there's a lot of problems that take place within the Russian Federation. But it has a war machine. It has the sheer numbers of soldiers that it can throw at this, and Vladimir Putin has been willing to let many, many soldiers die in this cause, and a desire on the part of Vladimir Putin to see as much of the former Soviet Union reconstituted as he can under his watch, because this has been, in his estimation, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the most tragic thing to befall the Russians since any time he can remember, certainly. So, you know, he has the motivation to keep going. And sadly, he will keep going as long as he doesn't feel like he doesn't have the cards. And the truth is, he does have cards to play with here. He's willing to sacrifice his men, women, his economy, whatever it is, to achieve his set goal.
And Jonathan, you know, the world was watching this moment inside the Oval Office this afternoon. I'm sure the wheels are turning for a lot of those NATO nations, especially the ones in Europe. Can you speak about what they may or may not do going forward? How can they be part of this discussion between Ukraine and the U.S.?
European nations have a decades-long relationship with Moscow that has taught them many things, and there's a reason why there is a NATO. There's a reason why Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, immediately when the Soviet Union collapsed, clamored to become NATO members. They see that as arguably more important to them as former Soviet republics than actually being members of the European Union. I've heard that said to me by various Eastern European leaders, that NATO is that guarantee, that security guarantee that they need, that there wouldn't be a repeat of what happened, for instance, to the Prague Spring in 1968, when the Soviets crushed an attempt by the Czechs and the Slovaks to have some freedom and get themselves out of the Iron Curtain and influence. What happened to the Germans, the East Germans, the control of all of East Germany and East Berlin, trying to break out of that. Poland's experience with Russia. Hungary in the 1950s invaded, taken over by a Soviet puppet regime to ensure that that country would be following the wants and aspirations of the Kremlin. So, and even Georgia, which isn't even part of Europe, in the Caucasus region, their experience with Moscow and with Vladimir Putin, who's tried to assert control and influence within what the Russians call the Near East, which in the near abroad, excuse me, which in Vladimir Putin's language is actually, in the case of Georgia, a former Soviet republic that should be part of the country that he grew up in and served as a KGB officer.
Jonathan Wachtel, thank you so much for your time and perspective. We appreciate this.
Pleasure.
All right, now I want to bring in Nina Khrushcheva. She is a professor in the Julian J. Stanley Graduate Programs of International Affairs at the New School and great-granddaughter of a former leader of the Soviet Union. Nina, great to have you on with us. Let's start with your reaction to what happened here in the U.S. today. I mean, what kind of implications did what happened today have on a global scale?
Well, we've never seen such a blow-up in the White House. That's just something that is completely unimaginable and unimagined until this moment. But I'm sure everybody basically shocked and says this. But it doesn't look very good for Vladimir Zelenskyy at this point, because as Donald Trump said, he doesn't have the cards, and he really doesn't. And so the question is whether Vladimir Zelenskyy will want to repair the relationship, which is going to be very hard because the relationship has been breaking down and breaking down and breaking down. And in fact, today's meeting happened because Emmanuel Macron, who was here earlier in the States early in the week, convinced Trump to meet with Zelenskyy. Trump didn't want to do it. So how it's going to be repaired? And we're getting closer to something that we've been speculating for at least last month, even longer since Trump got elected, is whether it's going to be America against Europe, which is also absolutely unheard of because America has been the leader of the Western world, so to speak, and is the primary member of NATO. So we are going to see more breaking, or maybe it was going to be more and more shock for Europe when it does want to create its own international agenda, its own military agenda, its own policy agenda, and kind of have to understand that America of Trump the next 4 years is not going to be a partner as it was before, but probably just continue to have some relationship. And so Donald Trump wouldn't damage the world more. I'd hope that Donald Trump wouldn't damage the world more rather than less.
Nina, for our viewers who are just joining us from across the country and around the world, we want to recap this heated meeting that happened between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and U.S. President Donald Trump inside the White House's Oval Office earlier today. Let's take a listen.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that. Remember this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. But right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country, that's back to you, far more than a lot of people said they should have.
And Nina, we want to welcome you back and get your perspective again. I want to read to you what Volodymyr Zelenskyy tweeted out just moments ago after he was ushered out of the White House. He says, "Thank you, America. Thank you for your support. Thank you for this visit. Thank you, POTUS, Congress, and the American people. Ukraine needs just and lasting peace, and we are working exactly for that." What do you make, Nina, of this response?
Well, it's nice. It's good. Zelenskyy stood up to Trump. Good for him. But the question is, when you have this kind of need in support of the United States, and you keep saying that you need this kind of need, and Keir Starmer of Great Britain and Emmanuel Macron of France just came a few days ago in advance to prepare for your visit, potentially that was not necessarily a very strategic response. It was a response of a president at war, but not of a politician. And I think with Trump, probably Zelenskyy this time needed to be more of a politician. On the other hand, since I am from a country of Vladimir Putin and other despotic leaders in the Kremlin, you never know. You can appease them. You can be very nice to them. You can compliment them, and then they're going to scream at you anyway. So, but he wasn't really very strategic and political in this. It seems that he wants to at least set it aside and keep this way. I think one argument that he made, I don't know if you're going to play it, when he was talking about Europe's support, and of course Trump is always repeating the same thing, that America did more and Europe did less, and so on and so forth. It would never have begun because if he were in the White House. But Zelenskyy said that we are defending Europe, that through Ukraine, through this fight, that's why we needed to be helped, because we are defending Europe. And if we don't defend Europe, then you are going to feel the same pressure from the Russians crossing the ocean or something like that. And for Trump, actually, it was a proof of his argument. It wasn't against Trump's argument, is that, you know what? If you are defending Europe and I'm telling you that Europe should do more, let Europe do more. And that's when Trump blew up and said, don't tell us how we feel and whether the Russians are coming for the Americans. So this is where, once again, it wasn't really, it was an emotional argument, and the argument that Volodymyr Zelenskyy has been making to Joe Biden all the 3 years. But that's not an argument to make for Trump. It's actually, that proves his point, is that this is European stuff, and we are fine, and we can help you out of a good nature. But if you are not grateful, you're just going to deal with yourself. So the next question, whether Europe is going to be ready to go with Ukraine going to war with Russia. That's, I think, kind of potentially the next breakdown that we're going to be witnessing, how Europe is going to play in this, although Zelenskyy did say we're not playing cards, but play in this scenario. Are they going to be a buffer between and try to move Ukraine and United States together, or they're siding with Ukraine? And then if they continue military help, military assistance, and Trump withdraws himself from any potential negotiations with Putin, then they may be indeed Third World War.
Yeah, I wonder what this might look like if America does pull some support from Ukraine, especially when it comes to that notion that you mentioned of America versus Europe.
Well, this is something we don't know. I mean, it's kind of, once again, in the 21st century, suddenly we're dealing with geopolitics of the 19th century. We know it from books. We know it when we talk about Putin's empire, but we don't really know how it works among democratic nations, because the nations we used to discuss in 19th century, Germany versus France versus Germany, they're all members of European Union, they're all members of NATO. So we are now dealing with similar points of China is a great power, Russia is a great power, America is a great power, Europe, countries together are great powers, but with different configuration. And so it's hard to predict how it's going to play out. I think that with this blow up, it's unfortunate that Starmer and Macron actually just came to the United States in vain. Whether they would want to pick up this mission of try to bring Trump on their side, on the Ukraine side, that's a big question. But what it seems that all this comments for democracy, for comments for we need to punish the aggressor, comments for all the things we have sort of used to in the normal world order are not going to work for Trump. So for him, only the economic argument works. And that's what actually the Russians are doing now. And it seemed to be more successful than American traditional allies in that.
And Nina, really quickly want to ask you, if Zelenskyy comes back to the White House, because this ended today with Trump saying he can come back when he's ready for peace, from a strategy perspective, what kind of approach do you think Zelenskyy needs to take if and when he does come back?
Then I think what Trump means is that if you're ready to cede territory, if you are ready to sign that rare metal earth deal. And you noticed in Trump's conversation, I remember his first term, he was talking about clean coal. I mean, I don't think he knows exactly what it is at all, but he likes the combination of words, the rare earth or something. So there's something, so it's going to be probably more drastic, but it should be, I mean, if I were advising Zelenskyy, I would really write in 2 columns, what I can expect, if I want, and I do want to work with the United States. One, what I can give up and what I can absolutely not give up. And if there is nothing he could give up, then he will continue fighting, and then Europe is on his side, and then maybe we are in another war bigger war situation. Or if he can give something up, I would put it in a column and say, okay, well, here is the things that absolutely impossible for me to give up. But on whatever other points, like 3 points, I'm willing to negotiate. And I think that more business-like approach and not a hero of war approach, because Trump doesn't want heroes next to him because he's the savior of the world, not anybody else. So no, the hero of war approach probably can work in strategic terms.
Okay, Nina Khrushcheva, thank you for your perspective on this.
Thank you.
And for more, let's bring in CBS News national security correspondent Charlie D'Agata. Charlie, what's the reaction this hour there at the Pentagon to all of this?
Well, there hasn't been an official reaction from the Pentagon, and I don't think we can expect to see a reaction from the Pentagon, from the defense secretary on down. You know, this would be in keeping with the White House. The Pentagon is here, and the Defense Department is here at the White House's bidding and the Trump administration's bidding. I think what we can add to the conversation is the amount of weaponry, the sophistication of the weaponry that the United States has been providing. I know that Major Garrett had already commented on the fact that there's been numbers thrown around $300 billion. It's far less than half that. Still a significant amount of money. But if the United States were to withdraw or to shut off that military aid, by the way, it should also be pointed out that a lot of that money goes right back into the U.S. military industrial base, you know, in terms of providing the weaponry. Most importantly, it will impact the artillery rounds. That's what Ukraine needs to continue fighting. And it's also, again, the sophistication of the weapons that the United States and this building provides in terms of the long-range weapons, the ATACMS and the precision weapons, the air defense systems. That is critical and vital. And that is something that will have an immediate impact on Ukraine if the United States were to withdraw its military support. You know, it has been said that the Europeans are going to step up. Prime Minister Starmer said that that would happen. But from Ukrainian officials, what they have said themselves is without U.S. support, they estimate that they can continue fighting for about 6 months. The fact of the matter is that they are outnumbered and outgunned by Russia in every meaningful metric. This has always been a war of attrition. If it were to be a war of attrition, it was one that President Putin would win. And I have to say, they'll be dancing in the halls of the Kremlin today. So this just came out from Deputy Chair Security Council Dmitry Medvedev. You may remember that name. He's been President, Prime Minister in the past. His words saying the insolent pig finally got a proper slapdown in the Oval Office. And Donald Trump is right. The Kyiv regime is gambling with World War III. That's just an indication of how this might be going down in Moscow today. And, you know, I was there. I was there in 2014, 2015. A lot of people think that the war began 3 years ago. This began more than 10 years ago with the annexation of the Donbass region by Russian-backed separatists. I was in Crimea. In the Donbass, when Donetsk fell, Luhansk fell, that has been territory that Russia had already claimed and then continued to advance. I mean, when there's a suggestion that this war was not started by Russia, I was in Kyiv. I was in the capital when the airstrikes began that morning. This is Russian aggression and containment. This is going to be, I mean, it already is a European problem, far more than it is an American problem, but it is going to be an increasing problem for Europe if they are called in to either police whatever sort of negotiation may come out of this. I mean, it's anybody's guess what's going to happen now after what happened this afternoon, but Europe will have to take a lead role in this, and I think they're aware of that.
Okay, Charlie D'Agata, stay with me. I want to come back to you in just a moment. But first, let's bring in CBS News national security contributor Sam Vinograd. Sam, what does all this mean for security and safety in Ukraine and the European continent at large?
Well, if we look at the near-term issues here, Chanel, it is really, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but it is really an outstanding question as to whether President Trump continues the current level of U.S. security assistance to Ukraine. Keep in mind that in addition to the billions of dollars the United States has provided to Ukraine, there are also very important weapon systems that we've deployed to the region to provide for Ukraine's security. like anti-missile defenses known as Patriot batteries. We have also provided really critical intelligence and logistics support to Ukraine to counter Russian aggression. And based upon what transpired in the Oval, it is an outstanding question as to whether President Trump continues all of that. At the same time, if we think longer term, Putin likely now feels like he has an open door to continue his treacherous work within Ukraine and potentially to expand on that into other parts of Europe in the months ahead. That is why, for Europeans, this is an existential crisis on their continent. They do not view Ukraine's sovereignty as charity work. They view it as providing for Ukraine and ultimately deterring Putin longer term. Americans historically have felt the same when it comes to Russian aggression. However, President Trump seems to think that Ukraine is a charity case rather than an important hedge against Russia.
And I wonder, Sam, what would happen if the U.S. got to a point where it said we're not supporting Ukraine anymore? Because you talked about some of the support that we're currently seeing on the ground. Would other European countries be able to bridge the gap there?
European countries have been scenario planning for this moment, unfortunately, since President Trump was elected. I say unfortunately because it's a very devastating conversation to have. However, I think it is unlikely that in a requisite and appropriate time frame, the Europeans could one-for-one backfill American support, both in terms of dollars as well as in terms of capabilities. The Europeans have said that they'll put forward a peacekeeping force. They have offered up a serious amount of money themselves to the Ukrainians as well as weapons. But I don't think that Europe is prepared or will be prepared in a short enough time frame to step in to fill the void created by the U.S. if we withdraw security assistance.
Okay, Sam Vinograd, thank you. And for more, want to go back to CBS News senior national security correspondent, that is, Charlie D'Agata. Charlie, thanks for standing by with us. You mentioned a really important point there that you believe Ukraine may only have 6 months of fighting ahead if the U.S. were to pull support. I just wonder if there is a peace deal on the table going forward, what this event today may mean for what that deal would look like.
Well, I mean, it's anybody's guess. It's going to be unpredictable in the next sort of 24 hours as to where this is going to move forward, because both sides have got to come to some sort of agreement. And that's, I think, Imtiaz had pointed out in Kyiv earlier that Ukrainians woke up today with a sense of hope that some deal might have been achieved. There was already negotiation in place. The White House had suggested already that Ukraine would have to give up its hope of joining NATO. And I think, by and large, many Ukrainians were giving up on that hope, because this is exactly what President Putin was trying to avoid, is NATO expansion and having a NATO partner right along the border. That was one of his justifications for the war to begin with, was to thwart NATO expansion. So I think they were willing to sacrifice that. They will have to give up territory. The White House has already suggested that that was going to be part of a negotiation going forward. And again, I have to say that the Ukraine has already lost about 20%, which is huge. It's a big country. 20% of its territory is already occupied by Russia and Russian-backed forces. So I think if that was your starting point, that would be where the negotiations would begin. What is important to point out here, and as Sam had pointed out, I think the critical mass is the air defense systems. This isn't an offensive weapon in trying to retake and reclaim territory that Russia will have already taken, but this is to defend Ukrainian territory, and specifically, big targets like Kyiv itself, and to protect the people of Ukraine and the government and the infrastructure, et cetera. Where Ukraine has stepped up, they have started making their own artillery, and they're world leaders in drones, in attack drones. So, I mean, even the United States is looking at the sophistication and the technology and range of Ukrainian drones. And by and large, they have been very effective against Russian forces. So they would continue to work in that manner. But as Sam pointed out, when you have these European partners getting closer to the physical fight, if they were to have a sort of a peacekeeping force in Ukraine, well, that in itself posits them right next to Russian forces. And as we've seen in many areas that I've personally witnessed around the globe, you know, these ceasefires are fragile, and they can shatter at any moment. And then you have an opportunity where you've got Russian forces pitted against European forces, not just against Ukrainians themselves. So, you know, we are at a very, very perilous and pivotal point in this conflict.
And speaking of how fragile this moment is and the prospect of a peace deal, there was some conversation about this inside the Oval Office. I want to play that sound for our viewers right now.
The problem is I've empowered you to be a tough guy. And I don't think you'd be a tough guy without the United States. And your people are very brave. But you're either going to make a deal or we're out. And if we're out, you'll fight it out. I don't think it's going to be pretty, but you'll fight it out. But you don't have the cards. But once we sign that deal, you're in a much better position. But you're not acting at all thankful. And that's not a nice thing.
And so, Charlie, based on your lengthy reporting inside Ukraine, I wonder how Russia is digesting this moment and how this could influence their strategy moving forward.
Yeah, well, you know, again, first of all, I've interviewed President Zelenskyy, and I know what kind of character he has, and I was watching that, and I was looking at his facial expressions because he has some control of the English language. Obviously, it's not his first language, but he understands almost everything. I could just see his facial expressions as he is sort of being berated by President Trump and JD Vance. And then he was able to, you know, communicate as well as he could with his control of the English language in arguing back. But he will be fired up. The people of Ukraine will be fired up and disheartened by what had happened. But the Russians will be celebrating. The Russian population, certainly the Russian government, President Putin, this plays right into his hands. And there are a great number of Russians who do support the war in Ukraine and do support President Putin. So they will be rallied by this. And again, you know, Ukrainians want this war to end more than anybody else. It may be that the Russians are tired of losing, you know, hundreds of thousands of their own fighting forces. They might want to see this brought to an end. But you know, the kind of language coming out of the White House will have crippled any kind of leverage and any kind of advantage that Kyiv may have thought they had going into today.
Okay, Charlie D'Agata, thanks so much. Let's bring in CBS News Chief White House correspondent now, Nancy Cortez, outside the White House. And just hearing now, Nancy, that Zelensky's canceled his speech at the Hudson Institute. I wonder how significant that is.
Well, it's definitely a sign that things have gotten seriously off track here in Washington, D.C., Chanel, a city where Zelenskyy has so often gotten a warm reception, but apparently his team informed the Hudson Institute that he would not be attending that public Q&A, and now we're watching to see if he goes ahead with a scheduled interview with Fox News scheduled for a little bit later today. Here at the White House, just a short time ago, longtime Trump ally Lindsey Graham, senator from South Carolina, spoke to reporters, and he said that Zelenskyy, if he wants to get things back on track with Trump, needs to apologize, and that if he doesn't, then the only other option is for him to step aside and send someone new to negotiate with Trump, because Zelenskyy ostensibly is not going to get anywhere any longer. That reflects the public sentiments of the Republicans who have been willing to speak publicly about this conflict so far, most of them showing support for President Trump, saying that it was Zelenskyy who was disrespectful, who challenged the president one too many times, who asserted his position one too many times when he should have been more deferential to the president of the United States.
And Nancy, interesting that that would come up, this notion of Zelenskyy having to now apologize before he returns to the White House. I want to ask you about JD Vance, because it was him who first used that word disrespectful. He had sort of a key pivotal role in this discussion.
That's right. He was actually the first, after sitting there silently for most of the conversation, to kind of go after Zelenskyy and say, you haven't apologized, you haven't thanked the United States, I haven't heard you say thank you once, and saying that Zelenskyy needed to be more grateful, almost berating him the way you would berate a sullen teenager. And that's what really got President Trump ginned up as well, and things just unraveled from there.
Okay, Nancy Cortez live for us outside the White House this hour. Thank you. And Max Bergman joins me now. He is the director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program and the Stewart Center in Euro-Atlantic and Northern European Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Max, good to have you with us this hour. I want to ask what your biggest takeaway was from today in terms of global implications.
Well, it's a shocking development, but maybe not surprising. I think it was pretty clear that the Trump administration had little interest in supporting Ukraine. That has been, I think, clear from the rhetoric from President Trump even before he was reelected, and that the efforts to negotiate a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia were sort of always fanciful. It didn't really make any sense, in part because the Russians clearly don't really have an interest in negotiating with the Ukrainians, and you kind of need the two warring parties to talk. And so I think it was inevitable that the United States was likely going to walk away from Ukraine. And for Ukraine, that would be, essentially a stab in the back. It's just really shocking that instead of a stab in the back, it's been sort of a stab in the face. And it's happened so directly and so explosively here in Washington. What was supposed to be a moment where Ukraine and the United States were, going to ink a deal. The deal wasn't that substantive, but still it was going to be a sign of, perhaps support for Ukraine. And instead, we've got the exact opposite. I think my broader take, though, is this: if you assume that Ukraine is now doomed in this war with Russia, I think I think that's really wrong. In part because Ukraine is standing up to Russia right now. And Europe, I think, seeing this is going to react with horror and I think increase of their efforts to support Ukraine. So to me, this looks like the United States really sidelining itself from leadership in this war, in negotiating a settlement. And I think it's going to have a chilling effect on allies, not just in Europe, but in the world.
Max Bergman, thank you for your perspective. And want to circle back now to Chief Washington correspondent for CBS News, Major Garrett, for your final thoughts, Major. Is a path to peace still possible?
Well, anything is possible, but it's much more difficult now in any way, shape, or form that looks out and for the long term protects the sovereign interests of Ukraine. And the prism for all this, I think, is something that sounds very scary but has no known definition: World War III. The Europeans and the Ukrainians believe if Russia succeeds in invading a sovereign country just because it believes it is historically part of Russia, and that's the only reason, and it can take over that country militarily, the prospects for that expansionism increase, meaning the prospects for a World War III, a conflict between Russia and Europe, therefore increase. President Trump seems to believe, and he said so, and the Russians amplified that today after this Oval Office dust-up, that the way to avoid World War III is to let Russia get what it wants out of Ukraine. That's a fundamental difference. The entire fate of the transatlantic alliance is implied there, as is the fate of the Ukrainians, and what Russia's expansionist appetites may be thereafter.
Okay, Major Garrett, live for us in D.C. this hour. Thank you so much, Major. Again, if you're just joining us now, we've witnessed some history here in Washington, D.C. this afternoon. There was a meeting scheduled between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and U.S. President Donald Trump. It was supposed to be a discussion about a potential rare mineral deal. As we've shown you all afternoon, that discussion was derailed, and the path to peace is now much more complicated. More on this. Stay with us here on CBS News 24/7.
I think I asked direct questions. I don't know that they're tough questions per se. When do consumers actually get to touch and feel a difference in their lives? So you would encourage Democrats to work with Donald Trump on an issue like healthcare. That's the role of Face the Nation, to focus on the issues at hand. That means a civil conversation with perspective.
Sunday morning, Wicked Oscar nominee Cynthia Erivo. A few words from Flo, plus 100 years of The New Yorker. Listen for the trumpet.
It was almost like being face-to-face with the devil.
Women riding bicycles dismembered.
She just vanished.
48 hours reports. I fought and fought.
911, what is your emergency?
She disappeared off the face of the earth. Ever think in your wildest dreams someone might want to kill you?
This almost became a game of psychological warfare.
You're caught. You're gonna go down.
Stream 48 hours, 24/7. CBS Sunday night.
Here we go.
The ultimate tradition continues.
From what I've seen, it's like chaos.
America's longest-running news magazine show is back
For 60 minutes! 60 minutes.
with a new season.
Hey, let's go.
You're willing to talk about anything. I'm open to all of it. Ask me the hard-hitting questions. So how do you get over the nerves? Honestly, it's a whole bunch of mind
The most influential people.
Who's the best coach in college football?
Let me see a mirror so I can look at it.
Are you a billionaire yet?
None of your business, man. You trying to get me robbed?
Investigative journalism.
Am I getting a real look at what life is like in here today? Absolutely not.
Do you think people visiting know that these were looted?
When stories threaten our way of life, 60 Minutes demands answers.
This is the pager that Hezbollah was using.
Do you have hope that you may find him yet?
They were asking me to do something that was illegal.
They're fighting for faulty parts?
Yeah.
What is the most important takeaway for our audience?
How big of a problem is doping?
Where was the military?
Why are people suspicious?
That sounds like a problem.
How is this possible?
Oh, come on.
Come on.
Whoa.
Wow.
What is going on?
I'm Scott Pelley.
I'm John Worth.
I'm Leslie Stahl.
I'm Bill Whitaker.
I'm Sharon Alfonsi.
I'm Cecilia Vega.
I'm Anderson Cooper.
This is 60 Minutes.
The CBS News original.
Showtime, baby.
It's time for 60 Minutes Sunday on CBS. Don't miss a minute. Now streaming. What happens when you get conversation over conflict?
I think they've taught me to have grace and compassion.
When we follow the human side of the headline.
I'm not asking that we ignore disability, rather that we do not ignore ability.
When news takes you where the story happens.
We've just crossed into Lebanon.
When the world's best journalists come together to cover your world, you get the all-new CBS Evening News every weeknight.
CBS News. Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan, Sunday on CBS.
Well, let me start with this.
This really happened.
Have you told the government?
Did any of that make sense?
What's your response?
You want me to just
What's
keep
wrong
going?
with that argument?
What have you
Do
learned?
you know why?
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 It's time for 60 Minutes. Sunday on
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here on CBS News 24/7. I'm Chanel Call in for Lindsay Reiser. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has now left the White House after things got heated with President Donald Trump. The